When you set up a corporation, if you're going to be having a charity that works in Arizona, you should incorporate in Arizona, right? Not necessarily. How familiar, have you guys heard about incorporating in Delaware? Is that something? Yeah, there's a reason, right? Delaware is a state that has much more flexible rules in terms of regulating corporations. The Delaware General Corporations Law, which is the DGCL, is what governs all corporations in Delaware, whether they're for-profit or nonprofit. And the incorporation process in Delaware is extremely simple. You file a certificate of incorporation with the Delaware Secretary of State. Usually you can get it filed either the same day or the next day, and you're done. That's it. Yeah, it's great. Exactly, and then welcome to New York. So some people do decide to incorporate in New York, and we do a lot of work with corporations that are New York corporations. And of course, we love our clients, but working with New York corporations is tricky because New York is a very regulatory-heavy state in terms of regulating nonprofits. As Bill mentioned, the New York Not-for-Profit Incorporation Law, which I'll call the NPCL, is the law that applies to nonprofit corporations in New York, and it's quite stringent in terms of regulating what nonprofits do in the state. It's nowhere near as easy to incorporate. You need to, again, file the certificate of incorporation with the Secretary of State, but you also sometimes need to get approvals from state agencies that will need to approve your corporation's purposes before you move forward. One example of that is if you want to set up a school in New York, you not only have to get the Secretary of State's approval of your certificate, but you also have to get the education departments. And that can take time because state agencies work on their own schedule, as I'm sure you all know, and it won't necessarily be a quick process.
Yeah, actually it's even worse than that. In the school, so it's like a clear example, but if you use the word education in your purposes,
exactly.
The Department of State will send it over to the education department and get their approval. So
even if what you're doing really doesn't have anything to do with the school,
right?
If you're using it in sort of a more colloquial sense, off you go, and then 2 months later you're going to get incorporated.
Right.
And in addition, beyond incorporation, the NPCL requires that you get approval from the New York Attorney General and from the state Supreme Court to do certain things once you are a corporation. If you want to merge with another corporation, you have to get approval. If you want to dissolve, if your corporation comes to the end of its natural life and you decide, okay, we're done, you can't just wind up and go home. You have to go through a fairly lengthy dissolution process, and you need to get approval for that. And if you want to make a transfer of a substantial amount of your assets, for example, if you want to sell some things, you need to get approval for that. And so because of all these considerations, we highly recommend that you use Delaware instead of New York. Okay. But there are some situations where you will have to incorporate in New York. If, for example, you expect that your organization is going to receive funding from New York State, there are some state laws that say that if you're going to get state funding, you need to be a New York corporation. And we understand why that is. They want to be able to make sure that they're watching the people that they give their money to. In terms of filing and preparing the certificate of incorporation, so the first step to form the corporation is you have to do the certificate of incorporation. And the most important part of that is the description of your corporation's purposes. If you plan to eventually file for federal tax exemption, you're going to want to specify in your purposes that you have a, quote, charitable purpose, which Bill will talk a little bit more about 501c3 purposes later, but it's usually charitable, educational, literary, scientific, or religious purposes. Delaware will let you put in your certificate of incorporation, I am a corporation formed for charitable, educational, and scientific purposes. End of story, and they'll accept that. That's completely fine with them. It's extremely broad, but it's just much less policed. New York is going to want you to be a little bit more specific. The issue with that is that you want enough specificity to pacify the New York State authorities, but you also want to leave yourself enough room so that when your entity expands or grows or changes, that you're going to be able to expand your purposes along with the change that's occurring in your organization without necessarily having to go to the New York State Department of State and amend your certificate of incorporation, because that also can be a tricky process. And then, as Bill and I were discussing earlier, regulatory approval is sometimes required if you have specific purposes that relate to particular departments. So if you want to run a school or if you want to run a social services agency, you're going to have to talk to some New York departments, and that can take some time. Okay, so once you have incorporated, what you're going to want to do is adopt bylaws. And bylaws are the set of internal rules that are adopted to help you manage the corporation. And they typically include provisions governing things like membership, if your corporation has members, which I'll discuss in a moment, electing directors and officers, holding meetings for directors and officers and members, and giving notice of those meetings, establishing committees if you want to set up committees for your organization, indemnification of your directors and officers, and then more formal things like how to amend the bylaws themselves. So, as I mentioned, a corporation can have members or it can be a non-member corporation. When you decide to have members, you're essentially trying to figure out how you're going to elect the directors of your corporation. In most membership organizations, the members have the power to elect either some or all of the directors. And although you'll notice that there are some membership organizations where the members don't have that power. Like, for example, if you can be a member of the Museum of Modern Art, and you're not going to have the power to elect their directors. That's membership as more of a fundraising tool, but usually members are used for director election. You can also use membership as a way to control an organization. If you, as an individual or you, an existing corporation, would like to set up a nonprofit, one way to make sure that you maintain a fairly tight level of control over that entity is to be the member of that corporation, which makes sure that you can elect the directors, you can usually amend the bylaws, things like that, so that you maintain control. And Delaware law was recently amended to require that all the corporations have members. That didn't used to be the case. You used to be able to choose. But there's sort of a tricky way around that. You can state in your bylaws that the directors are the members.